So the whole Franco Colapinto thing began as quite a nice story. The script said he would fill the gap at Williams left after firing Sargent, get the team to the end of the season so they can start the next phase in 2025 with Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon. Franco would then return back to a Williams reserve role, which may evolve into a full-time driver elsewhere, and things would continue as planned in a lovely, peaceful fashion. But in a very selfish way, Franco Colapinto showed us all that he was very, very good and disrupted everybody's plans. And considering he was straight out of the lower formulas with no F1 experience, it was exceptional. Exceeded all expectations and surprised everybody, including myself. This then led to calls saying that this guy deserves and needs a seat next season, otherwise it would be a travesty. Because this is a guy who is exciting, he's very likeable, he has an army of fans behind him and has also so far showed that he can hold his own on the track, despite the lack of experience. So what happens now? Well, that's the big question that's facing James Vowles and Williams at the moment and will require a brutal decision in some shape or form to be made. So let's stop lollygagging, click that subscribe button and let's have a little look at what lies ahead for old Franco. So straight away, the least blockbuster and most boring solution would be for him to remain at Williams on a test reserve role for 2025. And if things stay the way they are in the driver market, it's probably going to be the most likely option. Now, there's no guarantees for 2026, but for 2025, this means that Williams are going to have Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon and Franco Colapinto in reserve. And if you ask me, that is a pretty respectable lineup. Now, as long as no one swoops in for Colapinto in the meantime, this would set up Williams very, very well. Given that if Sainz or Albon had to sit out a race for whatever reason, Franco could step in no problem. But is that likely though? Well, given the length of the calendar and things like driver fatigue, illness, potential injury as well, staying at Williams for next year, that could be the best possible thing he could hope for. And from what we've seen so far, this would be fantastic for Williams, but for Franco, sitting around waiting for a seat, it's not really that ideal. And whilst he appears to be this humble kind of guy, I think he'll accept this, but there's also the risk that in this fast-moving world of Formula One, things like hype and positivity tend to drain away very, very quickly, especially if someone new arrives on the block. There's a lot of rookies starting next season, and that could be a possibility. And this only adds to the argument that you need to strike while the iron is hot, and I'll get into this later, but it also means that Williams need to make some proper big boy decisions, otherwise they risk losing him forever. Now, if he stayed for next season, it would be the ultimate win-win situation for Williams because right now, there's no guarantee that Sainz or Albon will stay for 2026. Sainz, I have no doubt, even if he's having a good year or not, will be looking for a return to the front as quick as possible and will drop Williams very happily if an offer is made. And Alex Albon, I think he's going to want to try and reinvigorate his career, which seems to have lost a little bit of fizz this season. Going from a wanted man in 2023 to basically an extra in 2024, he is going to want to reinvigorate his career and perhaps a move out of Williams could be the quickest solution there. Now, if either or both of those things actually happened, having a quick replacement that can slot in the form of Franco Colapinto for 2026 would solve a lot of problems for Williams. However, you also have to consider what if Sainz and Albon both do well and want to stay on for 2026? Where exactly does this now leave Franco? The odds are in that case he will surely end up somewhere, but where? Now that is the question. So now that we've got that option out of the way, let's look at something a little bit more juicy, and this is where Franco Colapinto gets the Williams drive. Now, in order for this to happen, James Vowles needs to get tough and pull on his big boy pants and make a hefty decision. Now, just very quickly, the attempts that Williams have made to rejuvenate the team and push it back towards the front of the grid is somewhat comparable to what McLaren are doing at the moment. You could argue that there is a formula to this, and Williams need to pay special attention to a massive decision that McLaren made a couple of years ago regarding one Daniel Ricciardo. Now, at the time, the announcement that Daniel Ricciardo's contract with McLaren would end a year earlier than planned, that came across as a bit of a shock. It was a decision that had massive potential to backfire, but by bringing in Oscar Piastri, the driver switch was almost seamless, and now McLaren are in a miles better position. And by now having this lineup of Lando and Oscar, they have almost future-proofed themselves as long as that partnership doesn't implode. So what I'm saying is that McLaren, or more accurately Zak Brown, he could have shied away from this. He could have pretended it was not there and just played it safe. and kept Ricciardo on for the following year as planned. But fair play to them, they didn't. They realised that there was a problem and they took care of it, with McLaren being the main priority of care. Part of any growth is sometimes making tough, horrible, brutal decisions. McLaren did this very well, and I sense somewhat Williams might have to do a similar thing either now or later down the line. And it could certainly speed up their journey back to the front as well. So if Colapinto is to get a seat at Williams for 2025, this means Carlos Sainz has to go or Alex Albon has to go. Highly unlikely, in my opinion, but also not impossible. So let's just say from here until the end of the season, Colapinto puts in some really impressive drives, outperforms or even matches Alex Albon, ending the season in great form, raising his stock, and puts him in a brilliant position for the following year. Now, you might remember that there were rumours that Red Bull were interested in Carlos Sainz being a potential replacement for Sergio Perez should he be dropped. And if they were to do so, they would have to pay Williams a release fee to break him free from his contract, an amount of millions and millions of dollars. And to be honest with you, if I was James Vowles and Red Bull put that offer on the table, and Franco Colapinto had just outperformed Albon towards the end of the season, I would take it. So firstly, that amount could be reinvested into other areas, modernise the team, reinvest into young talent as well. And secondly, with the case of Carlos Sainz, well, I think it's a case of you never miss what you never had. If Sainz was to leave Williams after absolutely nailing one season for him, that would be so much more painful, and you wouldn't get the financial benefit either. And possibly by then, Albon could be heading out of the team, and Franco too. So if Williams don't be careful here, they could end up with none of these drivers by the start of 2026. But now just going back to the Albon situation at Williams, this is a bit more of a difficult conversation to have. Now, James Vowles' plan is to get Williams up to the sharper end of the grid by 2026 and 27. If they produce a car that can do that, happy days. And if Carlos Sainz decides to stick around, that's great. We know he can control a race, he knows how to win, he has that experience. I think I'm going to have to put on my Alex Albon cap for this one. Now, Albon, on the other hand, I love the guy. He's been a fantastic servant for Williams, and he's done some amazingly unexpected things in a car which has no business scoring points. But even still, part of me isn't convinced he is the sort of driver that could start from pole, command a whole race, and finish first. Now, I'd love it if he did, I would fully welcome it, but my gut feeling is just telling me otherwise. Now, we saw how miserable he was at Red Bull and how he overcame this at Williams, but I think now we all noticed a little change in his manner and presentation when Colapinto showed up and scored points. So already to be appearing to be unnerved by your rookie teammate is somewhat concerning. And you do have to wonder, for the good of the team and its progress and to keep the momentum going, if Colapinto does close the season well, is it worth, for the future growth of the team, to put him alongside Sainz in the Williams? Now, of course, at this stage, I still don't think we know enough about Colapinto yet to make an educated decision on this. But when you compare both drivers' impact and trajectory when they first made their debuts, I would say that Franco potentially has the higher ability ceiling at the moment. It's very vague right now, but I think there are signs to show that he could go far. It's nothing personal, but it's like if a football team gets promoted from a lower league to a higher one. You, of course, have that striker that scored the goals and got you there, but he's probably gone as far as he's going to go. And then you need that new player with higher potential and can take things up to the next level that's required. Now, if any of you have played FIFA or Football Manager, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Start the new season with Sainz as the spearhead and Colapinto to soak up as much experience and knowledge and information as possible. Whereas I sense that Albon, he'll just see Sainz as a competitor or a colleague or maybe even a threat. But it is concerning from the Williams perspective, because I fear that if a tough, brutal decision isn't made, then potentially Williams could start 2026 without Colapinto, Sainz or Albon. And what do you do then? Well, you convince George Russell to rejoin the team, but that's another story. Now, finally, and I think this is going to be the most likely outcome from all of this, and it is that Colapinto will be convinced to join another team on the grid. And depending on what the media and the press say, this may or may not be true, but a couple of teams have been in the frame to to bringing him on. With a potentially vacant seat at Red Bull or RB, depending on what they decide to do with their drivers, of course. Now, Red Bull were looking 99% certain to be dropping Perez for 2025, but thanks to the arrival of additional sponsors, it looks like things are going to go ahead as planned, and he'll be at the team for 2025. This also means no promotion for Tsunoda or Lawson, so they'll be keeping their seats at RB, or Racing Bulls, or whatever it's supposed to be called for next season. And so, with the Red Bull RB alternative looking less bright, you would like to think that Colapinto, in some shape or form, will be in a Williams next season. And that was until Alpine and Flavio Briatore entered the chat. Now, to be honest, as a Williams fan, I never quite felt that Colapinto to Red Bull would actually happen. It didn't seem to make sense, and it just didn't feel right. It didn't seem like the best option for him at the moment. And also his management, I don't think, would consider that right now. But then this development that Alpine were interested in bringing in Colapinto alongside Gasly for 2025, which meant also benching Jack Doohan. This was something that seems certainly not impossible, because this whole move is being led by Flavio Briatore, and this thing of yoinking drivers out of other teams and placing them in his, that's exactly what he does. You know, say what you like about him, but he's a master salesman, and he's been doing this since the early 90s. Guys like Michael Schumacher and Fernando Alonso, also personal favourite Giancarlo Fisichella, all yanked out of other teams and placed into his own. Now, in all those situations, he paid a transfer fee to release these drivers from their contracts, and I'm sure he will be able to convince the Renault CEOs to cough up for Colapinto. And it's been reported that Williams have doubled the release fee for Colapinto, which leads me to think that inquiries have been made and conversations have already been had. So now, with all of this sort of stuff in mind, if Colapinto is on the grid next year, if I was a betting man, I would have to say it's going to be in an Alpine. It's just down to if Flavio can persuade Renault to splash the Euros. And this is where it gets quite difficult, because if Colapinto turns out to be the driver that we all hope and think he's going to be, and then they let him go to Alpine, Williams are never going to get him back. Honestly, when was the last time Williams had a young rookie driver that anyone was vaguely interested in signing? Perhaps Jenson Button, maybe George Russell, but actually, yeah, he was on loan from Mercedes, wasn't he? Nobody seems to be approaching Williams to buy Albon out of his contract, so, you know, what does that tell you? Losing Franco to a team like Alpine, who are more or less on the same level as Williams, would be a disaster for them. I think when it comes down to it, this whole Colapinto saga and how Williams handles this overall will be a test on how far the team has actually come since the Claire Williams days. Other teams out there we've seen, such as Alpine and Red Bull, who are clearly willing to be making absolutely brutal decisions and have made in the past. Williams needs to be prepared to do this too, especially if Franco really does turn out to be the business. But we also must be realistic and remember that this guy is still in his honeymoon period in F1. We of course haven't seen him yet when he really has to grind and push his way through a bad spell. And so yes, he is an amazing talent and he has absolutely surprised everyone with how he's been so far, but I think we all need to kind of take a breath and just see how he does in the closing stages. Because it's that performance in these closing races that is going to fuel a decision that will be made. And one way or another, it's going to be a brutal one.